everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel on label censorship in the alternative protein world. I'm Laura Braden, lead regulatory counsel with GFI's US policy team. And I'm really excited to introduce in just a moment today's panelists, an array of true experts on the topic of label censorship as it impacts alternative proteins, who will be sharing some of their experiences and insights with us. How to label alternative protein products has become something of a hot topic, not only in the US, but in other areas of the world as well. So what do we mean by label censorship? While alternative protein producers aim to achieve accuracy, transparency, and consumer appeal in the limited real estate of their product labels, some in the conventional meat and dairy industries have lobbied governments to restrict terms that can be used to name and label products that don't come from animal carcasses or lactating cows, restrictions above and beyond the general prohibitions against misleading labeling that are already in place. This attempted censorship of alternative protein product labels is what we'll be discussing today. It's a complex topic. Here in the US, it touches on multiple regulatory bodies on the federal level, as well as in individual states. And in our GFI US policy office, we have been and we continue to be involved in a number of efforts to combat nonsensical restrictions on terms that can be used in alternative protein product labels. These efforts range from work to defeat state legislation that would prohibit meaty terms in labels of products that aren't derived from slaughtered animals, to litigation challenging state laws of that nature that have been passed, to encouraging federal regulatory bodies to clarify that the terms consumers are familiar with can be used under appropriate circumstances in labels of plant-based meats and dairy products, as well as cultivated meat and seafood products. This is all done with the goal of ensuring that alternative protein producers' ability to communicate with consumers and consumers' ability to receive helpful information from producers aren't unfairly restricted. We're really lucky today to have an all-star panel to share their insights with us on key label censorship issues for alternative proteins today. We're joined by Jaime Athos, founder and CEO of Tofurky, Nicole Nicoletti, the Senior Director of Policy at the Plantbased Foods Association, Ellie Walden, Policy Manager at GFI Europe, and Shashana Weissman, Senior Manager of Digital Media and Communications and Policy Fellow at R Street Institute. Can we go to the next slide? Great. After I go over a few participation guidelines, this session will feature a discussion amongst our panelists. And then in the last 10 minutes or so, I'll aim to ask the panelists some questions submitted by the audience in the chat for this session. Next slide. You've probably already seen these guidelines if you've participated in other sessions over the past few days at the Good Food Conference. The one most relevant for this panel is Guideline 3. Audience participation will be via chat for this session. And please note that comments in the chat will be recorded and acknowledged whether or not we're able to address all questions raised during this session. And with that, we'll get started with our panel discussion. I'd like to first ask each panelist to introduce yourself a little more, tell us a little bit more about your work and how label censorship issues have intersected with it. Let's start with you, Jaime.
Yeah, hi. So my name is Jaime Athos. I'm the CEO of Tofurky. Tofurky is, if you don't know about us, we're a plant-based company, a entirely vegan company. And one minor correction there, you called me the founder on that title slide. Actually, we're founded by my stepfather, Seth Tibbett, in 1980. I'm not quite that old. And actually, the name Tofurky came along a little bit later. We were called Turtle Island Soy Dairy back then. And this is 1980. In 1980, it was very fashionable that if you were in the alternative soy foods industry making soy milks or tofu or tempeh in our case, you call it a soy dairy. And there weren't any cows in these dairies. And it's sort of almost foreshadows what we're going to talk about today. That market didn't have a problem with it. The consumers were able to not be confused by our soy dairy nature. And yet now it's a problem.
Super interesting. Thanks, Jaime. How about you, Nicole?
Thanks, Laura. Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. So I'm Nicole Nicoletti, Senior Director of Policy at the Plantbased Foods Association, the first and only trade association in the US for the plant-based food industry. And so my work over the past 6 years has touched on all the labeling issues that we're going to discuss today from different perspectives. And I began my career as a law professor, focusing my research and teaching on food systems and the regulation of food. And then I had the privilege of joining GFI as the first policy director. And during my time at GFI, we petitioned the FDA to issue a regulation clarifying that the use of terminology such as almond milk, soy milk, almond yogurt, et cetera, is permissible, given that these are well established in the marketplace and very well understood by consumers. And although I left GFI to teach at Harvard Law School, I continued working on these labeling issues by submitting comments to the FDA and the USDA on the labeling of both plant-based foods and cultivated meat as well. And I also published scholarship on these topics. And now in my new role at PBFA, I get to continue my relationship with GFI and collaborate on all of these and other issues and advocate on behalf of the plant-based food industry to ensure that companies can use truthful terms that communicate plant-based foods, how they're used, and what they are.
Great. Thanks so much, Nicole. Shoshana, can you introduce yourself a little more to us?
Sure, thank you. I'm Shashana Weissman with the R Street Institute. I come from a couple of angles here because I'm a lifelong vegetarian. I've never actually had meat except, those times by accident where vegetarians were like, oh, we didn't realize this was in it, stuff like that. But short of that, I've never had meat. And it's funny because I also grew up on Tofurky, so it's cool to be on a panel with Jaime here. And I'm also a regulatory scholar. So, natural vegetarian regulatory scholar marrying here. But basically, I try to fight regulations that don't help people, that often harm business and harm people. So these are very up my alley, especially from the vegetarian angle, having that really personal experience. And if there's evidence of consumer harm in a certain area, I'm always very open to, learning about it, making sure that something's taken care of. But anything that I've seen in this area is just like industries are kind of mad that people can use similar terms to them. So I work in all of that stuff. I also handle R Street's digital media. But the last thing I'll say too is the kind of perspective I come at it from. When I was little, my parents were kind of hippies. They still are, but would never really let me have candy and stuff like that. So I remember showing my dad a lollipop, and we looked at the ingredients, and it was like different kind of metals and other stuff. And he's like, this isn't good for you. Like, these things aren't here. But it was allowed to be called raspberry lollipop. Like, there was no issue there. And that wasn't pretty clear on what's in that stuff, which is, I guess, okay, maybe not great for everyone. But I was the annoying kid who went to like the Air and Space Museum, and they asked, hey kids, what's metal in? And I raised my hand and, I'm the wet blanket and say, oh, it's in lollipops. And he's like, I guess, yeah, thanks, weird kid. But, from that kind of labeling to where it says almond breeze or whatever it is, people can tell the difference. The worst case is someone accidentally eats a vegetable, which I know can happen to the best of us. But yeah, so I think that this is something really important. We want to keep truth in labeling and really allow people to describe the things they're selling and not get in the way of that. So I'm really passionate about this from a couple of angles, and I'm really lucky to be able to work on this, sometimes yell at legislators about it and do stuff like that.
Awesome. Thanks, Shoshana. And then Ellie, tell us a little bit about your work around labeling with GFI Europe.
Sure. So hi, good evening, everyone from Brussels over here. So yeah, my name's Ellie Walden. I'm one of GFI Europe's 3 policy managers based over here in Brussels. And yeah, amongst other bits of work that I do for GFI, I lead on our labeling work stream, which is all about ensuring that the legal framework in Europe allows for transparent and consumer-led rules for the labeling of alternative proteins. So what that looks like in practice, as I'm sure we'll get into in the discussion today, is essentially mobilizing against attempts in Europe to restrict the language available to plant-based companies. So we led 2 major campaigns on this front last year, which I'm sure we'll talk about today. And looking ahead, what that work's increasingly, I think, going to look like is ensuring that when we see cultivated meat on our shelves in Europe, we can ensure that the kind of legal framework around that for labeling is as clear and consumer-led as possible. So yeah, that's kind of the work I do, and it's great to be here. We're looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Well, I'm super excited for this discussion as well, and we will come back to learn more about some of those European efforts. But I wanted to kind of set the stage by thinking about this issue from the industry and consumer perspective. So Jaime, I'm hoping that you can talk to us a little bit more about how Tofurky approaches labeling and how laws and regulations restricting labeling have affected Tofurky and its customers.
Yeah, sure. So as we all know, there's some sort of economic advantages that the animal industry has. And, it kind of puts us in this position of having to justify higher prices. And the way that our industry has done so, the way that Tofurky has done so, is to really say loud and proud that our products are vegan, they're plant-based, they're soy, they're pea, whatever they are, because that's value added to the consumers that are seeking out products like ours. They're, our core consumer, our average consumer is somebody who is caring about the types of foods that they eat. Maybe they care about the environment, maybe they care about their personal health, maybe they care about animal welfare, maybe they care about all those things, but they're willing to pay a higher price for it. They're seeking it out. And so our strategy has been to just really lead with that. It's built right into our brand name, a portmanteau of tofu. It's really obvious what Tofurky is about. I don't think anybody's deceived, and our goal is not to deceive, because I think a person who thought they were buying a cheap subsidized meat product would be shocked at the little bit higher price that your typical plant-based product has. So, our strategy has been to be very transparent, to lead with the attribute that people are looking for, which is that these products are plant-based. This strategy worked great from 1980 until about 2018, and that's when we saw the first of these state kind of nomenclature labeling laws pass in Missouri, and that's when we became co-plaintiffs along with GFI, and sought to challenge the law. I mean, for one thing, the legislative record was very clear that the goal there was to protect the animal industry, and there was sort of this gloss, this pretext of consumer confusion placed over that, but nobody's confused. That's an absurdity. Nobody's confused, and I think they kind of let the cat out of the bag with their discussion of protecting their animal industry. So now it's become a little bit different. There, subsequently a patchwork of different types of legislation have passed throughout different states and whatnot. So we've had to go on the offensive and fight, or rather the defensive, and fight these things in court. But at the same time, we really haven't changed our core strategy. Our core strategy is just be transparent, just be honest, just tell people what they're eating. I think that's what everybody deserves to know, what they're putting into their own bodies or into the bodies of their children and their families. It's very unsophisticated, be honest.
Well, so as you mentioned, Jaime, we did see starting in 2018 kind of a slew of states passing, either trying to pass and in some cases passing laws that restricted use of terminology, either by prohibiting use of terms like burger or sausage or other traditionally meaty terms on product labels for products that weren't made from animal carcasses, or imposing kind of unique restrictions on how those terms could be used if they were used on a label that might not apply in other states or more broadly. And that seemed to be gaining some traction for a while, but in this past year, in 2021, label censorship came pretty close to passing in Texas, but ultimately didn't. So this might end up being the first legislative session since 2018 in which no label censorship laws in the US states pass affecting non-animal meat or dairy products. Shoshana, I'd love to get your view on what you think is going on there. Do you think state legislators have gotten wary of these laws, or is there something else at play in your view?
So usually stuff like that is caused by a bunch of different factors. It's rarely one, at least in the cases I've seen. But I hope that my part going around warning legislator and governor friends, like, hey guys, there's these bills and please, come on. So I hope that has played a little bit of a role. But generally, I think people realized that there's no evidence backing it up, that there's a lot of public dissatisfaction with it. It's an issue that I've been able to talk to people about really easily. Certain regulatory issues just go way over people's heads because they're complicated. But with this one, I think people realize, hey, this label is very clear. I'm not confused about that. And I also think it deals with the pandemic. I think that's a part of it too, that there's been different focuses from the pandemic, even from some of my other work in tech with Section 230, a lot of people are way more focused on that, which I don't particularly love, but it is kind of drawing attention away from here a little bit. In the past couple of years, during the pandemic, there's been a lot of focus on just things like telehealth reform and other things up that alley, which is totally sensible. But I think between these laws not always passing, between the uphill battles and the negative public response, as it should be, when there's messaging from lawmakers like the meat industry deserves better. It's like, okay, so now you're throwing consumer protection out the window. A lot of times in these kind of areas, when the ulterior motive is economic protectionism, you'll have examples of you'll have stuff made up a little bit more to show, like, here's examples of consumer harm that we're loosely tying together, such as when the FDA basically said, almond milk has lower protein and other vitamin content than regular milk, and that may be true, but there was no claim to the contrary. But I've seen less of that stuff on the states, and I think, in my opinion at least, the initial failure to even window dress what this was really all about ended up hurting a lot of these efforts, because consumers and people who might have been interested in this if it was messaged better, for the lawmakers' negative efforts, weren't drawn to it, because they're like, okay, well, why do we care about this industry? Not really sure like why we need to protect them over this. So that's kind of what I've seen. I don't think they made a really good, compelling effort, and I think groups like Good Food Institute and groups like Tofurky, fighting this stuff, I think that really makes a big difference, because if you guys don't do that and people don't hear about what's going on and there's no PR around it, then this stuff can just get through, no public backlash, no consequences. So I'm grateful for all of your work, because I think that is why, above all, that's why this stuff is stopping.
Well, that's a great pivot to litigation that's been going on over the past few years, both challenging state laws that we've just been talking about, and then also some litigation involving similar issues with respect to plant-based dairy products. Nicole, I would love to get your view on any trends you see emerging in recent decisions on label censorship laws or enforcement actions that affect plant-based meat and dairy products.
Yes, I think we're definitely seeing some trends, and they're very promising, and they prove many of the points that Jaime and Shoshana were making. And so I think a growing body of case law demonstrates that there is no evidence of consumer confusion in regards to plant-based foods, that naming conventions like almond milk, vegan butter, vegan cheeses, those kinds of naming conventions are not misleading to consumers. And therefore, laws that are going to ban or attempt to ban terminology are likely to violate the First Amendment. And then finally, that there's no valid reason to change any of the current naming conventions, which have been in existence for decades. And so I think the recent victory that Miyoko's Kitchen was able to celebrate illustrates this trend. And so just to give a little bit of context about that case, in December of 2019, the California Department of Food and Agriculture sent Miyoko's Kitchen, which makes vegan butter and vegan cheeses, a letter, and they cited the federal definition of butter. And they demanded that Miyoko's remove the term and also remove other phrases such as cruelty-free and the marketing slogan revolutionizing dairy with plants from the labels. So Miyoko's challenged the agency's enforcement, brought a First Amendment claim, and the court ruled twice in favor of Miyoko, first on preliminary injunction and then on summary judgment, which demonstrates that this was not even a close call. So as a result, the company can continue to use the current naming conventions, vegan butter, continue to use its mission statement, revolutionizing dairy with plants, and continue to use phrases such as lactose and cruelty-free. And so I think this is a very important contribution to that growing body of case law. And we've also seen this trend in several of the lawsuits that Jaime has been involved in. For example, in Arkansas, where the court granted Tofurky's preliminary injunction and found that consumers would not be confused by use of terms such as burger, ham, or sausage on plant-based versions of those products. So I think we will continue to have victories along those lines.
Great, thanks, Nicole. Jaime, as a plaintiff in some of these cases, do you have any sort of high-level learnings to add to what Nicole said that you want to share?
Well, so I'm the least knowledgeable person about these actual issues. I've got to volunteer, but I'm a very passionate person when it comes to consumer rights and whatnot. I think my high-level learning is that we need to do a better job as citizens, as voters, of holding our elected officials accountable. Really, this stuff happens because, to Shoshana's point, we're not paying attention. And I think one of the things that Tofurky hopes to do is kind of bring these things into the news, into the national conversation, and make sure that people are aware of them. Because, when they're tested in kind of the public marketplace of ideas, people think these are absurdities. These laws are absurd. They ultimately don't serve the consumer interest either. There's a very real risk if we have certain states with different nomenclature requirements that companies are not going to be able to viably launch products in those areas, and those consumers, whether they're a minority or majority of consumers, they don't have access anymore to products. So that's my take home from the whole thing, is that we all need to be more engaged as citizens and do a better job of helping our democracy flourish. This is a pretty anti-democratic, anti-citizen sort of effort that we're seeing.
Awesome, thanks. So that's super helpful insight. Let's pivot for a moment to, or a few moments to the view from Europe. Ellie, tell us a little bit about the campaigns that GFI has been involved in over this past year and sort of takeaways from those.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, first off, I was just smiling a lot at all your comments about kind of the empty arguments around consumer confusion, because it's actually hilarious when all these debates were happening in Europe. Exactly the same thing, we were supposed to believe there was an absolute crisis of consumer confusion, shoppers walking around completely baffled by what a vegetarian burger was. And actually it was hilarious because the biggest European consumers organization during that whole debate came out and was like, well, we've surveyed consumers and 7 or 8 out of 10 of them are very happy and want these names to continue. So it just kind of exposed how empty that argument was. But yeah, in terms of the labeling battles that we've been involved in over here in Europe, so we've really been on the front lines of 2 kind of major fights on this issue in the last few years in Brussels. And both of these stemmed or essentially was snuck into a much bigger revision of a kind of cornerstone piece of EU policy called the Common Agricultural Policy, like a huge legal framework, and they were snuck in the middle of all of that happening. And essentially there were 2 proposals on the table. So the first one was essentially a straight up ban of any meat denomination, so burger, steak, sausage, to be used for products that aren't edible parts of an animal, as the amendment put it. So that was kind of the first proposal. And if that had been adopted, it would have been the first time any such kind of broad brush restrictions were applied to the plant-based meat sector in Europe, and it would have applied across all 27 countries in the EU. So kind of high stakes on that one. That's the first proposal. The second proposal concerned dairy, plant-based dairy, and it was a little bit more complicated because essentially in Europe, unlike the US, we already have so-called protections for dairy terms in European law. That's been the case since the 80s. So plant-based dairy producers can't use about 15 terms such as cheese, yogurt, milk. So, if I walk to my local supermarket here in Brussels, I'll never see oat milk on the shelves. I have to see oat drink. So that was already the status quo. And essentially the second proposal that we were dealing with went way, way further than that. It was incredibly extreme, and it would have essentially banned plant-based dairy producers from even being able to evoke or reference the concept of dairy on their labels. So completely crazy, completely far-reaching. We had no idea actually what the full implications of that would have been. It would have almost certainly have meant that, plant-based dairy producers couldn't use kind of terms such as alternate or describe their products as alternative to yogurt, or even use kind of adjectives like creamy. It could have even kind of extended to packaging styles. So is a butter block or is a milk carton evoking the concept of dairy? Like that could have been banned through this amendment. So yeah, really, really crazy. And that was proposal number 2 on the table. So at GFI Europe, we essentially absolutely threw ourselves into mobilizing and coordinating kind of the opposition to these 2 proposals. So all 3 of us in Brussels were working on this full time. And we had several strands of that work. So one and a big part of it was coalition building. So making sure as many other organizations, both on the NGO and industry side, were aware of this craziness and getting kind of sign-ons to letters. So we coordinated kind of a 20 NGO strong letter with signatories like WWF and Greenpeace. So that was kind of a big strand of the work. As well as that, we were doing obviously a ton of outreach behind the scenes to parliamentarians, making sure that they were aware of what they were voting on and how unpopular it was. And we also kind of leveraged a media campaign, and we literally generated hundreds of headlines like Brussels is going to steal your veggie burgers, and it was just ridiculing the whole idea. So it was very successful. And then, yeah, at the end of all this campaign, so the first proposal on plant-based meat, that was voted down, albeit quite narrowly. I think if 48 MEPs had switched their vote, it would have gone through. The second proposal on plant-based dairy, that unfortunately narrowly passed that stage. So that kicked off another sort of 9-month or so campaign to get that insane amendment taken off the table at the next stage of negotiations. And yeah, a lot of behind the scenes work to convince people to do that. But we very happily found out in April that had indeed been withdrawn from the negotiations. So yeah, 2 really successful, but incredibly kind of hard fought and hard won victories. And in terms of kind of the lessons learned from that, I think it really is about kind of coalition building. I mean, my main takeaway from those 2 campaigns was, yeah, exactly as Jaime was saying. I mean, as soon as you explain to people what's being discussed, it's ridiculously unpopular. But like with many things, kind of big NGOs and big industry bodies, won't necessarily prioritize this as an issue. They see it as relatively niche. You kind of need a go-between to really rally an opposition to it. Yeah, so I think, in our case, it's not every day that you get kind of corporations like Nestle signing up to the same initiative as Greenpeace, but when they do, it's an incredibly strong message to policymakers. So I think that would be my main takeaway, the importance of coalition building and kind of generating kind of an opposition to these plans. That's already lying in wait, but it just needs a bit of rallying.
Great, thank you so much, Ellie. Shifting gears back to the US for a moment, I want to talk a little bit about sort of federal level potential regulations and guidances. And Nicole, my first question on this is for you. We've seen pressure in recent years on US FDA to get involved in what proponents of this type of activity, tend to refer to as policing the use of dairy terms in particular for plant-based products. Where do you see that issue going in coming months?
Yes, the labeling of plant-based dairy continues to be a hot topic year after year. And that pressure that you mentioned, Laura, is coming from Congress through ag appropriations, both last year and this year, and most recently in the ag appropes for fiscal year 2022 in the report that did pass the House. They urged the FDA to enforce standards of identity for dairy products, and in an amendment that was accepted during the floor consideration, it earmarks $1 million to do so, which honestly is pretty absurd. And then we've also seen the Dairy Pride Act, which has been introduced in both the House and the Senate in this Congress, and the last one would do something similar in requiring the FDA to enforce standards of identity and issue guidance for enforcement, and then report to Congress about the action that it's taking to enforce standards of identity. So the FDA, from my view, has reluctantly, responded to all of these requests to do something about dairy standards of identity, and they've invited public comments repeatedly over the past few years, but they've not taken any enforcement action or issued any guidance. However, the agency did announce recently that it intends to issue guidance on the topic of labeling of plant-based milk alternatives. It would be a guidance to industry, and they have the goal of putting this out, publishing it by the end of June of 2022. So I do expect that the agency will issue some guidance. Hopefully this isn't a way to appease Congress and the dairy industry, but my expectation is that that guidance will just reinforce the agency's longstanding practice and policy of allowing terms such as almond milk and soy milk and oat milk. Consumers understand what this is. As we've been talking about, there is no valid reason to restrict any of this terminology. And we have, as I was mentioning earlier, a building body of case law that demonstrates that there is no consumer confusion. And if the FDA would attempt to restrict any of those plant-based milk terms, they're going to face a First Amendment challenge. And I think the agency understands that that would be very, very problematic. So I don't really expect anything to change, quite frankly.
And potentially the guidance, if it's along the lines that you're suggesting, could be a good thing for the industry.
Hopefully it will be.
That.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hey, can I jump in for a second? This to me feels like a solution looking for a problem. So the FDA has in place already regulations that allow for fanciful terminology. They allow for common or usual names. And common or usual name is basically the theory that you and I might not like it, that suddenly people use literally to mean figuratively, but the reality is that they do. That's now codified in Merriam-Webster's dictionary. And I don't like it, but that's how people use it. This is, the FDA kind of anticipated this problem. They had the foresight to put things in place to allow for this. An example of a fanciful name might be Tofurky. It's clearly not turkey. There are extra letters in there. So that, it should pass muster with FDA regulation. Likewise, if the whole world starts talking about veggie burgers, I guess that's what we can call them, right? So, I'm curious, how is there really any issue here whatsoever? It seems like to kind of over prescribe here runs afoul of these kind of rules they already have in place.
I think the dairy industry would very much like an interpretation of standards of identity to mean that if there is the term milk or yogurt or cheese, etc., on a package, regardless of the qualifying language and its use amongst the public, then it should be prohibited, which is kind of outrageous and in violation of the way that the FDA has been interpreting all the regulations which you just mentioned, common and usual name.
Nicole touched a little bit on the First Amendment issues that could potentially be at play in guidance from FDA on this topic. I want to talk to you about that a little bit more, Shoshana, in the context of an exciting new issue, which is that USDA and FDA are both seeking input on terminology and labeling regulations or guidance for cultivated meat and seafood. FDA earlier this year and USDA right now. Would love to get your take on the First Amendment issues that are at play in that, in those potential regulations, as well as more generally with the labeling issues that we're talking about, and how you think they'll play out.
For sure. And I think this one's a little different. I think the principles are all the same, but I think that this is going to be a little bit more difficult for consumers who I think are just a little bit confused about what cell-based meat is and stuff like that. So I can understand them wanting to research more, hopefully not regulate more, but maybe want to look into this a little bit more. But I'm hoping that they take the light touch, because that's what works. That's why I'm able to go to the supermarket and figure out which things do and do not have meat, with the exception of gelatin in it, which isn't everything and always frustrates me. I'm like, no, I want this cheese. But I'm really hoping that they take that lighter approach. But unfortunately, there's a lot of moral panic around it, kind of understandably, because society's changing quite a bit, and now we can grow cows from other cows without harming them, which is cool because I like not harming cows. I like to pet them when I'm allowed to. But I can get that there's a bit of a moral panic here, and any policy area with a moral panic has a higher danger of regulation. I'm dealing with that in other work I'm doing as it relates to social media regulation, certain moral panics around there that are identical to the kind of things you have when the bicycle was invented, when TV became popular, video games. It's not to say that there aren't real, concerns and even confusion about things, but moral panics tend to have really, really bad regulatory consequences when we let it. So making sure, I think we are on top of it. Any federal agency contacts we have, kind of making sure that we're weighing in through the regulatory process in interpersonal ways are all really important, because this could be something where they mandate not cell-based meat, but maybe this is part of a chicken grown from another chicken, click here or go to this website to learn about this whole process. And it'll become this immense mandatory disclosure thing that will kill businesses that are doing something really good for the environment and also for animals, while killing those opportunities while confusing people And there's also, as an aside, and it kind of relates to all of this, there's a great book on mandatory disclosure and how it constantly fails because government regulates and has so much mandatory disclosure, like, you know, the terms and agreements before you accept anything. You're not reading all that. And this could fall into that same problem, but also act as more of a barrier for consumers to know what they're looking at. So I'm hoping, I mean, obviously I'm hoping government will take a look at this and say, how do we just make sure it's clear, make sure that everything's accurate and consumers know what they need to? Do we even need to step in here rather than just go a harder approach, which I think could have bad consequences for everyone? And I think in this way, we all see how there's real potential for government to get in the way of an innovation by making it less marketable. But this is a really common regulatory dynamic where people have or new businesses have all these barriers. So existing companies, and while I love Tofurky, I want more companies to come up and I want there to be more competition so there can be more innovation. But barriers to entry make it so that you can't compete. It would have made it so that Tofurky couldn't exist at the time if there are certain regulations that people would look at something and say, what the heck is this? I'm just going to deal with this later. And maybe it succeeds despite that, but certainly not because of it. And there's a lot of really perverse regulatory dynamics. A lot of people hear regulatory reform and think, you know, just some nerd, and I am a nerd, but some nerd, you know, just trying to get rid of regulations to help businesses and that's it. But they can really hurt consumers, hurt economic progress, and hurt environmental progress. And I think this is one of those areas where it can bring people from the left, right, from business, for consumers, for everyone concerned about these issues together. It's nice when I'm able to get conservatives on board with this stuff, seeing, you know, hey, this is regulatory reform. And it's always negative when I see the conservatives who would rather go with the meat industry and be like, well, they don't want to grow new cows from cows, so I'm just going to do what they want to do and regulate in that way. Or, you know, they don't want to compete with Tofurky or with Gardein, so we're not going to, you know, do that or anything. So there's a lot of real moral hazards here that I think could occur. And and I know it sounds cliche, but really making sure that we're all involved with it, watching it as closely as Nicole is, as Laura is, and just making sure that if there's signs things are going awry, like they put out some data that's irrelevant but looks bad for the industry, making sure, hey guys, that's not the focus here. This is what we ought to be focusing on. All of that is really important to make sure that we don't get some really silly regulations.
Super helpful. Thank you so much. We've had a lot of activity in the chat, and I am going to soon turn to some of those questions and bring them to you all. I had one more question, and this is open for anyone who'd like to respond. But we've talked about these arguments that have been made a lot about consumer confusion as a sort of as a justification for label censorship laws and regulations. As Nicole mentioned a bit in discussing the Miyoko's opinion earlier, and in other cases as well, those arguments, you know, increasingly seem to be kind of thrashed in judicial opinions and in other writings. And so I'm curious what tactics groups that are in favor of these kinds of restrictions might be shifting to, and what the new sort of battlegrounds might be on a tactical level. Anyone want to share thoughts about that?
I can jump in on that. So yeah, I think this comes back to what I think someone said earlier, that, you know, as soon as these discussions go into the public arena, it pretty quickly get exposed for just a completely ridiculous argument. I mean, I think in Europe we saw that definitely, like, nobody came out of that debate who was proposing these veggie burger bans and, you know, stopping milk cartons. Nobody came out looking good after that ridiculous debate. So I think, I mean, from a very recent lesson in Europe, so rather than kind of going into the public arena, I think we're increasingly seeing, and I think we will increasingly see in the future, especially around cultivated, a more behind the scenes kind of tactics, you know, leveraging complicated loopholes of legislation. Nobody understands European legislation, how it's made, and I think they will definitely exploit those kind of complexities there. So I think, yeah, so just on the dairy thing I mentioned earlier, is one of the amendments that did sneak through. I mean, part of the reason that snuck through is nobody really understood the full implications. It was worded in such a convoluted way that people thought it was just kind of restating the existing legal situation in Europe. So I think we're going to increasingly see kind of using convoluted processes and behind the scenes tactics to try and kind of push through some regulatory hoops for the industry to jump through.
I saw you nodding.
I'll add on.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I was just going to say, I've seen a lot of the same, a lot fewer legislators out there on this. I know that there were many on the state and national level who had tried to say, look at me, I'm doing this, forgetting how small their natural audience for this was, and also getting kind of ripped apart, like, hey guys, this is ridiculous. Governor Ducey in Arizona actually, after he learned about the almond milk stuff going on, he made a joke about it at some conference he was on, like, guys, come on. So having other politicians weigh in, a couple of senators have been weighing in too. Senator Mike Lee is like, guys, stop doing this, which I appreciate. But I think they're going to go behind the scenes more. Also, just because it's not just this, but every argument I've seen gets torn apart. It's not just the false consumer harm thing, which is, I think, the most common tactic taken to get bad regulations. It's the one I deal with the most in occupation licensing reform. Oh no, unlicensed florists, like, you wouldn't want that. And here's some horrible things that could happen. It's the same dynamic I see here, and I do see regularly. But there was also, as I said, the meat industry deserves better, which is an end. It's not an argument. It's just kind of this random weird statement, but it was commonly used. And then I think the last one was just like, oh, this is different. It's weird. Saying, why can you call it a burger? And I have to remind people, burger is not a type of meat. Like, it's not. Oh no, this comes from the burger animal. But all of it, I think it's not just the fake consumer harm thing, but every argument was just so quickly taken apart. I will say though that what interested me was the efforts to prove consumer harm were weak. I'm sure if they wanted to get, scrap some stuff together to make it a little bit more believable, they could. And the fact that they didn't surprises me. Maybe they were too confident in this stuff. But I generally see more possible arguments, more, at least theoretically, you could see how something would happen. But I still think after the public relations failure, they just want to go where people aren't going to mock them and say, and then go to the legislators and say, oh, hey, why are you voting for this? Unfortunately, though, the regulatory process is a very dark place where you'll never know what you're getting out of it. And if you amend stuff that makes it seem like you're clarifying, but it actually adds on stuff, legislators can miss that. Most of them are understaffed, whether in the state houses or at the national level. And if it's not their top priority, it's easy to miss. So making sure, as I said before, we're on top of it so we can flag, hey, I know you think that this is just doing this, but functionally, this new amendment would function in this way. All that stuff is important. It's tedious, but it's how we stop stuff like this from becoming law.
Super helpful. Okay, I'm turning now to a few questions from the chat that have come up. And if people have additional questions, we have a few more moments on this panel, so you can continue to raise them in the chat. First question is for you, Ellie, going back to your outline of our recent activities in Europe. The question is, if these policy activities succeeded at the European level, are you confident that member countries will enforce them at the national level?
Yeah, so I mean, part of the reason we really spend a lot of our resources in Brussels at the European level is that, I mean, when it comes to kind of food labeling regulation in general and kind of labeling regulation and food regulation in general, a lot of that is centralized in Brussels and a lot of that is automatically transposed into national law. So that's really why we have 3 staff members in Brussels, because we realize how important kind of European policy is on that. So yeah, I think that's kind of the short answer, is that we need to focus on European policy because it has such a large reach. I mean, whatever happens in Brussels will have to go to each 27 member states, and that is a big market for these products, and it could have a serious effect on them.
Then there was another question for you, Ellie, about how did you get Nestle to cooperate in these efforts?
Sure. Well, actually, so very handily in terms of the timing for these debates popping up in Brussels, we, as GFI Europe, co-founded an umbrella organization called the European Alliance of Plant-Based Foods back in 2019, end of 2019, early 2020. So that's a big kind of umbrella organization of allies, including NGOs, but also industry. So Nestle were a part of that. We kind of spoke to them, and they were on board with that. So they're a member of EAPF. So yeah, it was, I mean, they've done a lot of great work on the plant-based foods. They've launched a really good pea milk very recently. They have a vegan bacon. So I think that's another lesson, I think, long-term in terms of kind of these big industry players. And I guess it's, you know, it's obviously why we have a corporate engagement plan at GFI, because we need to get these big kind of retailers also on board and realize that they also have a stake in these questions. So it was a pretty easy sell, to be honest. We didn't have to do much convincing with Nestle.
There were a couple of similar questions in the chat about other companies, getting other food companies like Tyson, Campbell, Soup and Cargill involved in efforts like this, and collaborating with incumbent players in general. Nicole, do you want to comment on what Plant-Based Foods Association does in terms of collaboration with companies like that?
The companies that you've mentioned are not members of PBFA. However, I will say that some of those companies are opposed to these label laws at the state level and at the federal level. And I think this is a good opportunity for us to ask, given that we've spent ample time talking about the absurdity of these laws. And from this conversation, there's no good reason that has come out as to why these laws should or could pass. So it begs the question of what's really going on here. And I think it's an opportunity for us as plant-based food industry and the growing all proteins industry and companies to think about an opportunity to take charge of the narrative and to understand what's really at the root. And from my perspective, what's really going on here, given that some of these big companies, even those involved in animal agriculture, are not in support of these laws. But again, from my perspective, what I see is a growing discontent, fear, and concern about livelihoods on the part of the farmers and ranchers who are involved in animal agriculture. And the truth is that they're not benefiting from the current system, but they see yet another threat to their livelihoods. And so the work that PBFA is going to be continuing to do and to build out is to present the growing plant-based food industry as an opportunity to American farmers. So of course, we've got to fight these laws for all the reasons that we've discussed, but I think it's time to shift the narrative, right? And to address these underlying concerns. And something that has struck me to kind of tie in everything that we've been talking about over the past couple of days here in the conference is the collaboration that is happening at all levels and amongst so many different stakeholders. And I think that we need to be able to articulate the benefits of these growing industries that we are all a part of to all stakeholders and to not leave the farming community out. And how can we be a part of a just transition for the farmers, for their communities, for workers across the food chains? And that doesn't mean that these labeling laws are going to go away, but I think it's a way for us to start to address that underlying concern and discontent. That is really why they thought, okay, let's try to pass a labeling law, and maybe that will help our industries that are going away because of consumer choice. So I took us on a little bit of a tangent, but I think that that's something for us all to be thinking about and to be working towards.
I love that comment, Nicole, and how it ties into other issues that we've been talking about over the past few days at the conference. That's great. And I'd love to hear if anybody else has sort of final thoughts or closing comments in the last minute or two of our panel that they want to share. Please jump in.
I'd just like to kind of support what Nicole said. I mean, I think there could be a situation where there don't have to be losers here. I don't think that the kind of animal agriculture companies want to kill animals. That's not their primary goal. They want to be a profitable company. I think those ranchers want to put their land to use. I think there are ways that we can reform government policy and priorities and subsidies such that the actual externalities that are inherent in those businesses are not borne by the public at large, that they're borne by the companies. They're reflected in the shelf price, and that we don't support practices that are ultimately detrimental to the health of our planet or our country and whatnot. Let's redeploy those dollars and retain or retrain or adapt the industries that are so like dependent on kind of animal agriculture, and get them prepared for this kind of brave new world that we're all entering. You know, radical food system change is going to happen. It's a matter of, do we get on board with it? And you know, like, first to act is going to be first to profit, I think, ultimately. And we as a country, the US, should be thinking of it in those terms. Let's get on board.
Super great points, Jaime. Ellie or Shoshana, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I actually really, really like that. In other policy areas I work in, you know, we deal with a lot of the same tensions of changing economies and stuff. And if industry was more directly working with the people whose jobs would change, I think that would ease so many tensions. So I just wanted to say I love that. And also, not to be too hippie, you know, yay, but it is really cool to see industry and policy leaders here, to see everyone here working together, because in so many other industries, you know, and Jaime, you as the CEO of Tofurky might say, oh, well, hey, these labeling laws can cut out competition. People will still remember who we are and go with that. I see too much of that. So the fact that you're willing to really fight the good fight, not just for your company, but for other new people who might come along and have innovation, that's something that's really, really heartwarming to a very stressed out regulatory scholar.
Yeah, and I just finished by just saying, yeah, wholeheartedly agree with everything Nicole, Jaime, and Shoshana just said. Absolutely, we need to bring farmers along as part of the transition. I mean, I probably would say this as a policy manager, but that's also double downs on the reason why we need governments really to buy into this and recognize all the benefits and of this, and be able to direct that transition when it does come, and make sure the communities that will be affected will be brought on board and will be able to benefit from it, because it is ultimately in the interest of everyone, in the climate of us all. So it reiterates the role for governments here, I think.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. This has been such a great discussion. I've learned a lot and it's been so fascinating. Really appreciate everybody attending and for your questions in the chat as well. Thank you all. We've got one more final wrap up for the conference following this session. So hopefully everyone will stick around for that and have a great weekend.